People who can speak multiple languages, what language do you think in? I'm fluent in English, Vietnamese is my mother tongue, speak a little French. I mainly think in English since I moved to US, but my dreams come in Vietnamese still. French when I speak French, English when I speak English. Sometimes English when I speak French. I'm French too. That's weird. Sometimes it's faster to just think in English rather than French, it seems. It's interesting to see so many people with English as their second or third language and they only think in English. Interesting stuff. My first language, Romanian. Second, German. Third, English. My brain, fuck your mother language, let's go with English. Does it switch around or is it mostly just English? I am fluent in both Spanish and English, but I only think in English, lol. Is it your original language or is Spanish? I can think in them all. When I'm speaking a language, I think in that language even if I'm not 100% fluent. When I'm not speaking, I generally think in one of two languages I'm a native speaker in. I don't consciously control it. Sometimes I'm surrounded by one language and my brain randomly starts thinking in the other, but usually I'll think in the language I last used. First language, Danish. Second language, English. Third language, German. It switches between Danish and English. Edit, rip my inbox. I'm Anglo and my French is fading, but when I'm super pissed I swear in Canadian French, if only in my head. I forced myself to think in Dutch when I was learning it. It's a good way to speed up learning a language. French Canadian swear words are the best and most effective emo. My first language is Swedish, but I'm fluent in English and pretty much only speak English at home. I can also understand Danish and Norwegian and speak a bit of French. I mostly think and dream in English unless I've been speaking/reading a lot of Swedish or if I'm doing stuff where my vocabulary is lacking in English. I knew it, Scandinavians know a lot of languages. While I was in seminary at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, there was a professor there who was very skilled in languages. For example, he was planning a trip to Turkey to study something, and someone asked him why he was reading a book in German, and he said the best book on some specific part of the Turkish language is written in German. There was a story that might have been urban legend, but one day he was walking across the quad and the school president stopped him and said, "Drive gentry, how are things going?" "I'm disappointed." "Why?" "Because I know 9 languages, but can only think in 5 of them." Edited to add, school. I started off thinking in English and then translating Spanish into English in my head. It took a lot of effort. The weirdest thing was when I started knowing words in Spanish that I didn't know in English. And then it was weird again when I started understanding Spanish words and sentences without having to consciously translate them into English first. It was like I would hear someone say something in Spanish and the understanding of the whole meaning of the sentence would pop into my head the same way as when someone said something in English. I learned English much earlier in life, so that's my default, but if I'm hearing Spanish or listening to Spanish music or media, or even sometimes when I'm not, there are a lot of times when I think in Spanish, too. And honestly, I kind of prefer thinking in Spanish, but I'm not quite sure why. I speak Portuguese, English, Spanish and German. In my house multiple languages were spoken in a mix at all times. Words in sentence weren't exactly from the same language. I speak with my family like that. I think in no language in particular and it's second nature. When just speaking a single language at a time, I typically think in that language. When it comes to counting, it's mostly German. My first language is Portuguese and I can speak a little bit of Spanish and I'm fluent in English. I'm not surrounded by people talking in English whatsoever, yet I mostly think in English. It makes no sense to me, but oh well. I consider myself to be fairly fluent in English. My thoughts partially switched to it when I was around 17 years old. I had been speaking a little English since I was 3, but I started seriously studying the language only when I turned 16. Currently, my inner monologue is both in English and in my native language. When I'm giving a speech in my head, discussing some concept with myself, I usually think in English. On the other hand, my inner voice uses my native language for the most of the mundane things, like my exams are tomorrow, yet here I am, browsing Reddit. Also, on some rare occasions, I hear nothing and just know what I'm thinking about. I live in America now, fluent in English, French, Bosnian, and Dutch. I always think in French. I was born and raised in France, so it's personally what I find more comfortable. Loving this thread because it's sort of blowing my mind. Also, everyone in this thread chose to think in English to comment. Edit, grammar. To be fair, people who browse an English-speaking site are more likely to be consuming mostly English media. A combination of all the languages I speak, though the one I'm predominantly using at that point in my life takes precedence. For example, a thought I had earlier was, what have I forgotten? J'ai dû faire quelque chose. J'ai dû French, I had to, faire quelque chose Italian, do something. Or, penso che ho, key. Which is a horrible key hybrid that sums up my thinking quite well. Or I might be greeting someone and my first instinct is to sew it French, but I'll have to switch last minute to the language I should be using with them. It's messy and annoying but pretty cool, honestly. I never understood that. I don't think in a particular language. I never did. I think in like thoughts. I don't know. The pure concepts just flow into my head and I then translate them into speech. There was a poll on Reddit a while ago that showed that roughly 75% think in actual words, which completely blew my mind. I'm Dutch, but when I was young, 6 to 10 years old, I was online talking English so much that I was getting better in it than Dutch, and I eventually started thinking and taking notes for school in English. Even though my English isn't as good as before, I still always think in English thanks to this. Landverrader. First language is Greek, German. Second language, English. I can think in all three of them, but if I have been using one of them more than the others, my mind gets stuck to that language for some days. This means that even though Greek is one of my native languages, I will start thinking in English as soon as I am required to use it extensively over a period of 4 days. Baby talk would definitely help if you're in tech support. In all of them. Also in pictures, animations, music. I don't think in words. Hi everyone, I'm from Kazakhstan and I know Kazakh and Russian language for 100%, English, intermediate, and can read in French we learnt at school, Korean I interested in, and Turkish. I'm introvert, so I felt comfortable when others don't understand what I'm saying, so I can say what I really think of this person without hitting him. To improve English, I try to think in English. Sometimes it turns out that I forget the words in my native language or Russian, and replace the words with English words. I know that 3 languages are not so much, but I hope it was interesting for you. I only speak German and English. I mostly think in German too. My native language is Spanish, but currently live in USA. I think in English. I think we usually think in the language we are surrounded by if we are fluent. My native tongue, but when I'm thinking about a concept that doesn't have a word in my native language, I think in the language that has. I fluently speak 3 languages and currently I am learning a 4th one. The only time I need to think in a language is when I have to write. Normally I don't process my thoughts like series of words or phrases, but by mere concepts and sometimes images. If I read or hear the word apple written in English, I don't need to translate it to my mother tongue. The image of an apple just pops up in my mind. Same goes for abstract concepts somehow. I'm Indian and hence know 5 languages. The language I think in differs according to situation. If I'm thinking about my family related matters, I think in my own mother tongue. When I'm thinking about friends, it's in the language we converse the most, i.e. Hindi. Thinking about work life is always in English. Rest of the 2 languages I don't think in much. It's strange how I hadn't noticed this pattern until I thought about it now. I think about memes in English too, courtesy Reddit tongue. I speak English, Swedish, French and Spanish. I'm born in the US but spent most of my childhood, 7 to 18, abroad. Yet I still doggedly think in English. Weirdly, I sometimes dream in French but never in Spanish or Swedish. In order of learning: 1 English, 2 Spanish, 3 Japanese, 4 Chinese Mandarin. Also some Russian, German, and ASL. When I know I'm going to be using them, I think only in Japanese and Mandarin. I also accidentally interchange words a lot in these two languages, even though they are very different. My Russian isn't very good anymore, but when I first started learning I loved thinking in Russian. Same with German, although I will think in this occasionally. As far as Spanish, I can understand it spoken and written, but can't speak it well. Guess I don't really think in it. I don't really think in ASL either, but will sign sometimes, like for music or something I can't say out loud. Sometimes also when drinking. Looking back, I learned Chinese Mandarin and Japanese mostly through music and TV shows, because in that way it's easier to see the language applied. I believe it also makes it easier to think in. All the other languages didn't hold my interest quite the same, probably because I couldn't enjoy the types of things in those languages that I enjoy in English. Sometimes I think in ASL signs, but equally in images. I'm deaf. ASL is my 4th language that I've learned. After spending just 2 weeks in Germany to learn the language, I found myself thinking almost exclusively in German. It was hard because I didn't have vocabulary for a lot of things yet, but when I came across something like that, my brain would think in pictures or in really strange German descriptions before it would even try going to my native English. It really seems to be tied to whatever I spoke last. I can't force myself to think in German now unless I say a sentence or two first. It just clicks and I can't switch it back to English unless I do the same thing again. I don't think in a language. I think in images and concepts of sentences. Now this is a fucking question. Native in Polish and German, later learned English to fluency, French halfway, and bits and pieces of some Asian languages. Strong emotions are strictly Polish, var. All the rational thought almost exclusively German. Sometimes English creeps in, especially at work, where it's the main language. I'm pretty sure I don't think in any language except when I'm thinking about language, such as pondering this question or thinking about the precise words to say. The rest of the time, I'm pretty sure it's just pure thought. I wonder if there are brain scans monitoring Broca's and Wernicke's areas as we think about random stuff without linguistic prompting. Something I can help with. I'm American. I've always spoken English. My parents both can speak other languages, and taught me a bit of Japanese growing up, but for all intents and purposes, I spoke only English. Until high school, when I had to take a foreign language. I chose French because I was 14 and thought it might be useful on dates. It wasn't. However, my best friend was in the same class and pressured me to do 4 years of French with him. He was a lot more motivated than I was, even though we both got good grades. Anyway, the summer before our senior year, we have AP French homework. This isn't like a few pages of worksheets though. No, this is like full research projects and essays. One day I wake up and there's 2 weeks left of summer, and I haven't done any French yet. So I start putting in crazy hours working on French and only French. It's 8 hours a day of studying and working, and it's a struggle since I'm not the best student. But a few days before school starts, something different happens. I wake up ready for another exhausting day of French. Only it's not another day, it's un autre jour, quel doula. I'm thinking in French. I've been working in it so much that my brain's been wired for French now. That kind of changed how I think about things now. I wouldn't consider myself fluent in French, but it's taught me the importance of immersion. Taking a challenging college course. Don't distract yourself with YouTube, put more time in your studies to get yourself thinking about that more. It's been super helpful, having a way of changing my mindset like that. TLDR, if you've never learned a foreign language, try. It changes the way you think.